In the sweltering summer of 1793, Philadelphia stood proudly as the magnificent and bustling capital of the new United States. But a refugee ship from the distant Caribbean quietly docked at the port, secretly carrying a deadly, invisible phantom inside. They were fleeing a bloody revolution, but unknowingly brought infected mosquitoes, carrying the ultimate terrifying nightmare. The dark nightmare began when perfectly healthy citizens suddenly collapsed with raging fevers and agonizing, crippling body pain. This devastating disease, later known to history as yellow fever, rapidly turned the glorious capital into a living, burning hell. The initial symptoms were incredibly cruel. Innocent victims were violently tormented by splitting headaches and severe muscle cramps. After just a few short days, the patient's skin and eyes began to turn a highly sickening, terrifying, and unnatural shade of yellow. Their livers were being completely destroyed from the inside. Incurable blood began to slowly seep from their eyes, noses, and gums. But the absolute most horrific sign of impending, unavoidable death was the violent vomiting of a thick, dark, and foul black liquid. Doctors of the era called this brutal phenomenon the vomito negro. It was actually severe internal bleeding from the ruined stomach. Patients violently groaned in absolute agony and deep humiliation. The foul stench of rotting death quickly filled every narrow alley. Blind panic rapidly swallowed the entire city whole. The heavy atmosphere was completely dominated by an unprecedented total terror. The incredibly young federal government of America completely collapsed instantly before the terrifying raw power of untamed nature. The great President George Washington had to hastily flee the capital on horseback to desperately seek safety in the distant country. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton also fled in desperation. The most powerful leaders were completely helpless against the germ. Over 20,000 panicked citizens frantically fled Philadelphia. They abandoned their homes, wealth, and even sick loved ones. The dusty roads were heavily jammed with wooden carriages carrying wealthy families, desperately trying to completely outrun the Reaper. Neighboring towns ruthlessly set up heavily armed checkpoints to strictly block anyone carrying the invisible plague from the capital. The incredibly poor, who absolutely could not afford a carriage, were tragically trapped inside a rotting, slowly dying, silent city. Philadelphia rapidly transformed into a terrifying ghost town. Every shop was boarded up. No one dared to step out into the sunlight. Terrified people completely refused to shake hands on the street. Even the closest friends walked on the opposite sides of the road. The only noise breaking the deadly silence was the heavy rattling of wooden death carts slowly rolling past the dark, closed houses. The exhausted cart drivers constantly shouted into the thick, ominous fog, "Bring out your rotting, dead bodies for the mass graves." The bodies of highly unfortunate victims were heartlessly dumped on porches, waiting to be violently thrown into cold, nameless pits. Helpless, orphan children wandered crying through the completely empty streets. Their parents had died horribly in their own beds. The complete lack of basic medical understanding at the time made this bloody tragedy exponentially more devastating and much deadlier. In the 18th century, science knew absolutely nothing of viruses. They had no idea the tiny mosquito was the true mass killer. Arrogant doctors completely believed the disease spread through miasma. They blamed the foul, toxic air blowing from polluted swamps. America's most famous and respected doctor, Benjamin Rush, bravely stepped up to desperately save the dying, rotting capital city. But his outdated, incredibly barbaric medical treatments were an absolute living nightmare for the already extremely weak patients. Rush blindly believed that the deadly yellow fever was directly caused by the severe overstimulation of the human blood vessels. His core medical treatment was highly brutal, relentless bloodletting. He thought he had to violently drain the toxic blood entirely. Desperate doctors used incredibly sharp blades to slice into patients' veins, ruthlessly draining liters of precious, vital lifeblood. Rush violently drained up to 80% of the blood from some poor patients, rapidly pushing them over the dark edge of death. Combined with the severe bleeding, he forced patients to swallow massive, toxic doses of mercury to violently purge their bowels. This ruthless purging completely exhausted the dying bodies. Rush's terrifying methods likely killed more people than the actual germ. The wooden beds were stained with a horrific mix of dark red blood and black vomit. It looked exactly like a brutal slaughterhouse. Despite those desperate and flawed efforts, the brutal death rate absolutely continued to soar to incredibly horrific, dark numbers. By dark October, there were horrific days when the bleeding city recorded over 100 tragic deaths in just 24 hours. The field hospitals quickly overflowed. Bush Hill, an abandoned luxury mansion, was heavily converted into a massive quarantine zone. Initially, Bush Hill was a true hell on earth. Dying patients lay on the filthy floor, groaning helplessly in their own foul waste. The dead and the living lay side by side for days. There was simply not enough healthy men to remove the rotting, swollen corpses. In that deeply desperate context, the true, unsung heroes of Philadelphia bravely stepped out from the heavy shadows of segregation. Benjamin Rush begged the Free African Society for help, led by the highly courageous black leaders Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. There was a deeply racist medical belief that black people were completely biologically immune to the deadly yellow fever contagion. Knowing this was a lie, the brave African American community stayed to deeply care for the painfully dying, bleeding white citizens. They courageously entered highly infected homes, deeply comforted the dying, and safely buried the extremely dangerous, toxic bodies. Without these incredibly brave black nurses, the entire city of Philadelphia would have been completely destroyed in the rotting storm. But their incredibly noble sacrifice came at a massive, bloody price. Hundreds of brave black citizens also died from the infection. Tragically, after the dark pandemic, they were not honored, but were ruthlessly, viciously slandered by the racist white newspapers. Cruel papers falsely accused them of aggressively exploiting the absolute panic to heavily extort money and steal from dead victims. History strongly proves that the extreme cruelty of humans is sometimes far more terrifying than the smallest invisible killer germs. As the dark autumn slowly passed, the deeply traumatized citizens desperately prayed for a miraculous divine intervention from above. And finally, a true miracle arrived in early November. It did not come from human medicine, but from a massive sudden weather shift. A massive, incredibly dense frost swept over the dying capital. The bitter cold rapidly froze every stagnant puddle in the dark city. This thick ice instantly killed millions of infected mosquitoes that were aggressively breeding in the dark, forgotten, ruined corners. Absolutely no one at the time truly understood why, but the terrifying yellow fever epidemic suddenly, miraculously stopped completely. The massive death toll dropped. The terrified citizens who fled began to slowly, timidly return to their cold, dark, and empty homes. President Washington finally returned to the broken city. Heavy wooden shutters were slowly opened to let in the bright, warm sunlight, but Philadelphia was deeply, permanently scarred forever. Nearly 5,000 innocent citizens were violently erased in 3 months. 10% of the entire capital's population was completely annihilated. The dark graveyards rapidly expanded with nameless markers. The city's economy was totally devastated. Thousands of crying orphans desperately needed newly built, highly crowded, dark orphanages. The horrific 1793 pandemic exposed the extreme fragility of the young nation. An invisible virus almost broke the great new democracy. It forcefully compelled the government to deeply consider new public health quarantines and strict, entirely new urban sanitation laws. However, the true cause of this disaster remained a completely sealed mystery for well over 100 long, incredibly confusing years. People blindly blamed the highly toxic clouds from swamps or the rotting coffee beans left completely dumped on the filthy, hot docks. It wasn't until the early 20th century that a brilliant army doctor named Walter Reed conducted incredibly dangerous experiments. He and his incredibly brave research team actively allowed the suspected mosquitoes to bite their own bodies to find the deadly root. These highly lethal, terrifying experiments finally proved conclusively that yellow fever was completely transmitted by mosquito bites. This shocking truth completely exonerated the swamp winds and successfully unmasked the true, tiny flying serial killer in the shadows. This massive scientific discovery paved the way for eradicating yellow fever in the Americas, saving millions of future human lives. It also allowed humanity to build the Panama Canal, a project completely delayed by this highly terrifying, incredibly deadly illness. For the citizens of 1793 Philadelphia, this knowledge came far too late. They paid an incredibly brutal, totally bloody, dark penalty. The horrific image of doctors in dark coats, holding bloody blades to slice patient veins, remains an absolute, terrifying nightmare. Bleeding patients violently vomiting thick black liquid while desperately begging for life in dark, suffocating rooms is completely unforgettable. The horrific yellow fever epidemic is a sharp, cruel reminder of humanity's complete impotence against the raw power of wild nature. Despite advanced weapons, great constitutions, or declarations of independence, humans are still highly fragile, weak biological beings. A single mosquito carrying a microscopic strand of RNA was enough to completely subdue history's absolute greatest founding fathers. This tragedy deeply teaches us absolute humility. Life on Earth is a highly fragile web, easily cut by unseen microscopic dark forces. Looking back at the dark past, we see not just immense pain, but also incredible resilience and extraordinary absolute human courage. Free black citizens bravely faced extreme danger to save the very people who had previously brutally oppressed and deeply enslaved them. They are the absolute brightest testament to the glowing light of humanity in the very darkest, most desperate hours of human history. The nameless graves in Washington Square remain today, acting as silent witnesses to an unforgettable, incredibly deadly, dark summer. Beneath the vibrant green grass lie the thousands of skeletons of unfortunate victims violently swallowed by the horrific vomito negro. Whenever you hear the soft buzzing of a mosquito in the silent dark night, remember the total panic that completely ruined a capital. The dark threat from highly infectious, insect-borne diseases is absolutely not over. Terrifying dengue and Zika still silently lurk.